The winter of 1887 left marks on Dakota Territory that older settlers still hadn't stopped talking about when the blizzard of 1888 came to finish what the cold had started. But before either of those storms, before the snow, buried fence lines, and the frozen cattle stood stiff in their pastures like wooden carvings, there was a woman named Sigrid Kavalin working alone in the dirt behind her house. And nobody thought to ask her why. They saw the hole. They saw the shovel. They saw the old woman on her knees in the clay pressing flat stones against a wall that nobody asked for in a space nobody needed underneath a woodshed that most people wouldn't have bothered to build in the first place. And they laughed. Not meanly at first, the way people laugh at something they don't understand and don't want to. The way a man laughs when he wants to feel smarter than what's in front of him. They laughed and they moved on and they stacked their cordwood against their walls the same way their fathers had. And they told each other the old Norwegian woman was going soft in her old age. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the small space under that woodshed was about to become the most important structure in a 20-mile radius. And by the time they understood what Sigrid had built, it would be too late for some of them to be anything but grateful they had known her at all. The land remembers everything. It remembers the weight of glaciers that carved these valleys 10,000 years before any human foot pressed into the soil. It remembers the buffalo that once darkened the horizon like storm clouds made flesh. It remembers the grass fires that swept across the prairie in walls of orange light, and it remembers the silence that followed. The land remembers the first settlers who came with their plows and their ambitions and their profound misunderstanding of what this place could do to a person who wasn't ready. And the land, if it could speak, would tell you that it remembered Sigrid Kvalin from the moment she first set foot on it in the spring of 1873. She was 25 years old then. Her husband Ivar walked beside her, his hand on the trunk of tools in their wagon, his eyes scanning the horizon for something that looked like possibility. Their daughter was 2 years old and sleeping against Sigrid's chest, unaware that she was being carried into a country that would test her parents in ways they could not yet imagine. They had come from the Telemark region of Norway, a place of deep valleys and short summers, where every family learned to manage cold the way other people manage debt, carefully, methodically, and with a healthy respect for how quickly it could ruin you. The letter of introduction to the land agent in Yankton turned out to mean almost nothing. The man barely glanced at it before pointing them toward the unclaimed acres near the James River land that looked like an ocean of grass frozen in mid-wave stretching in every direction until the sky swallowed it whole. 160 acres. That was what the Homestead Act promised them. 160 acres of possibility if they could prove it up within 5 years. Ivar had smiled when he saw it. Sigrid had not. She had looked at the emptiness and seen something her husband could not see. She had seen the wind that would come screaming across that flat expanse with nothing to stop it. She had seen the winters that would arrive like punishment from an angry God. She had seen the distance between their claim and the nearest stand of timber, 15 miles to the northwest, and she had understood immediately what that distance would mean when the snow came. But she said nothing. Because Ivar was already walking into the grass, already measuring with his eyes, already building in his mind the life they would create here. And Sigrid loved him too much to take that from him before the land did it itself. They built their first shelter from sod because there was no timber within 15 miles. Sigrid had never lived in a house made of dirt. In Norway, even the poorest families had wooden walls, wooden floors, wooden roofs that kept out the rain and the snow, and the relentless cold that crept down from the mountains every winter. But here on this ocean of grass, there was nothing to build with except the land itself. Ivar cut the sod in bricks 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, each one held together by the tangled roots of prairie grass that had been growing and dying and growing again for centuries. He stacked them like masonry, leaving spaces for a door and 2 small windows that Sigrid covered with oiled paper because glass was a luxury they could not afford. The soddy, as the settlers called them, was dark and damp and smelled of earth. When it rained, water dripped through the ceiling for hours after the sky had cleared. Insects lived in the walls. Snakes sometimes found their way inside seeking warmth, or mice, or both. But it was shelter. And in that first winter, shelter was the only thing that mattered. Sigrid survived those months by luck and stubbornness, and by following almost instinctively the habits her father had drilled into her from the time she could carry wood. She kept the fire burning low and steady, never letting it roar and waste fuel. She sealed every crack she could find with a mixture of mud and grass and rendered fat. She hung blankets across the doorway to create a dead air space that would slow the escape of heat. And when the worst nights came, the nights when the wind howled so loud it sounded like a living thing trying to tear the Saudi apart, she held her daughter against her chest and listened to Ivar's breathing in the darkness and told herself that they would survive this. They did survive it, barely. By spring, they had lost two of their three chickens, their only milk cow, and nearly lost each other to a fever that swept through the settlement in late February. But they were alive, and in Dakota Territory in 1874, that was enough to call a victory. The years that followed were a slow accumulation of progress. Ivar broke ground through prairie grass that resisted the plow like rope. He planted wheat and watched it grow, and harvested it with hands that had become as calloused as leather. He made the trip to Huron 23 miles to the northwest and traded grain for lumber, bringing back pine boards strapped to his wagon like precious cargo. By 1880, they had a proper house. 2 rooms, a cellar dug into the earth beneath the kitchen floor, a barn for the 3 horses they now owned, and a woodshed that stood 20 feet from the bay door filled with split oak and pine that Ivar had hauled from the mill in Huron over the course of 3 summers. Sigrid planted a garden. She raised chickens. She learned to make soap from rendered fat and lye, and she learned to preserve meat through the long winters, and she learned to read the sky in ways that would have seemed like magic to the girl she had been in Norway. She also learned to love this land despite everything it had taken from her. Or perhaps because of it. There is something about surviving a place that wants to kill you that creates a bond deeper than affection. It is the bond of adversaries who have come to respect each other. The bond of a fighter who has gone 15 rounds with an opponent and knows in that exhausted clarity that comes only after the final bell that they are both still standing. Sigrid learned to love Dakota Territory the way a sailor learns to love the sea, not because it was kind, but because it was real, and because in its brutal honesty it had shown her exactly who she was. Then the land took Ivar. It was the spring of 1881. Sigrid was 33 years old and in the 3rd month of a pregnancy that had come as a surprise to both of them. Their daughter was 10 and had grown into a serious child who rarely smiled, but who could split wood with an accuracy that made the neighbormen shake their heads in reluctant admiration. Ivar had been breaking new ground on the North 40, a section of land they had been preparing for wheat for 2 years. The soil there was thick with clay, and the plow kept catching on roots that should have rotted away years ago but somehow hadn't. He came home that evening with a cough. Sigrid thought nothing of it at first. Men coughed. The dust from the fields got into everything, into lungs and eyes, and the creases of skin that no amount of washing could ever truly clean. She made him tea with honey and told him to rest, and she expected that by morning he would be himself again. By morning he was worse. The fever came on the 2nd day. It took his appetite on the 3rd. By the 4th day he was delirious, calling out names that Sigrid didn't recognize, speaking in rapid Norwegian, that she could barely follow his eyes open, but seeing something that wasn't in the room. She sent their daughter to the Thorvald farm 3 miles to the east to fetch help. But there was no help to be had. The settlement had no doctor. The nearest physician was in Huron, and by the time anyone could have made the journey there and back, it would have been too late anyway. Ivar died on the 6th day just as the sun was setting. Sigrid was holding his hand when he went. She felt the moment his grip loosened, felt the strange relaxation that moves through a body when the person inside it is no longer there. She sat with him for a long time after that, still holding his hand, watching the light fade from the window, and listening to the absolute silence that had descended on the house. Their daughter stood in the doorway, her face expressionless, her hands hanging at her sides. Neither of them cried. There would be time for that later. But not yet. Not while there was still work to be done. They buried Ivar on the small rise behind the barn in a grave that Sigrid dug herself because there was no one else to do it. She marked it with a wooden cross that she carved from a piece of the same pine that had built their house, and she said the words that needed saying, old Norwegian words that her father had taught her and his father had taught him. Then she went back to the house and made supper for her daughter and sat down to eat as if nothing had changed. Because in Dakota Territory, grief was a luxury that the living could not afford. The land didn't care that you were mourning. The crops still needed tending. The animals still needed feeding. The winter was still coming, whether you were ready for it or not. And Sigrid Kvalin, whatever else she might have been, was not a woman who let herself be unprepared. The pregnancy ended 3 weeks later. Sigrid woke in the night to a pain that she recognized immediately, a deep cramping that started in her lower back and radiated forward like something inside her was trying to tear itself free. She lay in the darkness for a long time, breathing slowly, waiting to see if it would pass. It didn't pass. By dawn, it was over. She buried what remained next to Ivar's grave in a hole so small it seemed impossible that it could have contained so much hope. She didn't carve a cross for this one. She couldn't think of what to write. The summer of 1881 was the hardest season of Sigrid's life. Not because of the work, though the work was brutal. Not because of the loneliness, though the loneliness pressed on her like a physical weight. But because every morning she had to wake up and decide consciously and deliberately to keep living. There were moments in those long summer days when she stood at the edge of the wheat field and looked out at the horizon and wondered what would happen if she simply started walking. If she walked until she couldn't walk anymore. If she let the land take her the way it had taken Ivar, the way it had taken the child she would never hold. But then she would hear her daughter calling from the house, or see the horses waiting at the fence for their evening feed, or notice the way the light fell across the wheat in that particular golden way that happened only in the hour before sunset. And she would turn around and walk back to the life she had built, because walking away would mean that everything she had suffered had been for nothing. And Sigrid Kvalin would not give the land that satisfaction. 2 years later, the fever came again. It swept through the settlement in the late summer of 1883, carried by no one knew what, spreading from farm to farm like wildfire through dry grass. 3 children died in a single week. The Nygaard boy, who was only 4. The Halverson twins, who had just turned 6. 3 small graves in the churchyard, 3 families destroyed by something they couldn't see and couldn't fight and couldn't understand. Sigrid watched her daughter with a fear she had never felt before. The girl was 12 now, tall for her age and strong from years of work, but strength meant nothing against fever. The strongest men Sigrid had ever known had been brought low by sickness that seemed to choose its victims at random. Every morning she checked the girl's forehead for heat. Every evening she watched for signs of lethargy, for the glazed eyes and flushed cheeks that marked the fever's first approach. Every night she lay awake listening to her daughter's breathing, counting the seconds between each inhale, waiting for the rhythm to change. The fever never came for them, but Sigrid couldn't shake the terror that it might. And so in the autumn of 1883, she made a decision that tore something permanent out of her chest. She sent her daughter to Minnesota. There was a cousin there, a woman named Birgit, who had married well and lived in a proper town with doctors and schools and all the things that Dakota Territory could not offer. Sigrid wrote to her and explained the situation, and Birgit wrote back immediately saying, "Yes, of course, send the girl, we will care for her as our own." The morning her daughter left, Sigrid stood at the edge of the property and watched the wagon grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared over the horizon. She stood there for a long time after it was gone, long enough for the sun to move noticeably across the sky, long enough for her legs to begin to ache from standing still. Then she turned and walked back to the house and sat down at the table where she had shared meals with Ivar and learned to read with her daughter and made plans for a future that no longer existed. She wrote to the girl twice a month. Every 2 weeks, regular as clockwork, a letter would go out on the mail wagon to Huron and from there to Minnesota. The letters were not long. Sigrid was not a woman of many words, but they were consistent. They were reliable. They were proof that the connection still existed, even if the distance had grown too great to see across. Her daughter wrote back less often as the years went on. At first, the letters came every week, then every 2 weeks, then once a month, then sometimes not at all for 6 or 8 weeks at a stretch. The letters themselves changed too. They became shorter, more formal. The intimate details of daily life that had filled the early correspondence gave way to brief updates and polite inquiries, and the kind of distant courtesy that strangers use when they have nothing real to say to each other. Sigrid kept every letter in a tin box under her bed. She read them sometimes at night in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come, trying to hear her daughter's voice in the words on the page. But the voice grew fainter with each passing year, until finally one day it was gone entirely. By 1886, when the digging began, Sigrid Kvalin was 62 years old. She lived alone, and she had not been inside another person's home for social purposes in longer than she could precisely remember. The neighbors knew her as quiet, capable, and strange. They borrowed her tools and returned them without conversation. They noticed she kept better stock than most and wasted less wood than anyone. But they did not know her. Not truly. And they had long since stopped trying. Sigrid understood this and she accepted it. She had learned in the years since Ivar's death that solitude was not the same thing as loneliness. Loneliness was an ache for something you had lost. Solitude was simply the absence of what you no longer needed. She had her work. She had her animals. She had her letters to a daughter who barely answered them anymore. And she had her memories, which were sometimes a comfort and sometimes a knife and sometimes both at once. That was enough. It had to be enough because it was all she had. The summer of 1886 was the summer Sigrid decided to build what her father had called, in the old dialect, a varma, a heat core. The memory came to her in early June, arriving uninvited like a visitor from another life. She was sitting on this porch of her house, watching the evening light move across the wheat fields, when suddenly she was 11 years old again and standing in her father's workshop in the valley outside Kvitaside. Torsten Kvalin had been a builder. Not just a farmer who built things when necessary, but a true craftsman who understood wood and stone and the forces that move through them the way a musician understands sound. He had hands that seemed too large for delicate work, but that could fit a mortise and tenon joint so precisely that no nail or peg was needed to hold it together. He had also understood cold. In the winter of 1841, a storm had come through the Telemark Valley that was unlike anything anyone had seen in living memory. The snow fell for 6 days without stopping. The temperature dropped so far below zero that water froze in kettles placed directly on hot stoves. 11 of the valley's 40 horses died. The roof of the Lutheran church collapsed under the accumulated weight. And Torsten Kvalin, watching his neighbors struggle and suffer and lose, had remembered something his own father had told him years before about the way the Romans had heated their bathhouses. Hypocaust, that was the word. A system of channels beneath the floor through which hot air from a furnace would circulate, warming the stones from below and radiating heat upward into the room above. The Romans had used it 2,000 years ago in a climate far milder than Norway's to keep their wealthy citizens comfortable while they bathed. Torsten had studied the principle and adapted it. He had built a chamber beneath his workshop lined with stone, connected to a firebox at one end and a flue at the other. He had heated the stone slowly over many hours and then sealed the firebox and let the accumulated warmth do its work. The concept was not complicated. The execution was. But Torsten had been a patient man, and he had understood something that most people never learn, that the solution to cold is not more fire, it is more mass. Stone holds heat far longer than air. Stone does not blow away in wind. Stone does not run out like wood. If you heat enough mass, enough dense, slow-conducting material, and seal it beneath the ground where the temperature is stable year-round at approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit, that stored heat will bleed upward slowly and steadily for days. Not the explosive heat of a large fire that roars through its fuel and leaves you shivering an hour after the flames die down. Something quieter, something almost alive, something that feels, as Torsten had once described it, like the earth breathing. Sigrid remembered standing in her father's workshop on the first morning after he had fired the heat core. She remembered the way the floor had been warm against her bare feet, even though ice had formed on the inside of the windows during the night. She remembered looking up at her father's face and seeing something she didn't fully understand at the time, but that she understood now: pride. But not the proud kind of pride, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from knowing you have built something that will outlast you. The kind that comes from solving a problem that everyone else had given up on. She remembered her father looking down at her and saying in his slow, careful way, "The cold is not the enemy, Sigrid. Ignorance of the cold is the enemy." She had been 11 years old then. She had not fully understood what he meant. Now at 62, sitting on her porch in Dakota Territory while the summer light faded and the first cool breeze of evening moved across the fields, she understood perfectly. The digging began the next morning. Sigrid walked out to her woodshed as the sun was coming up, carrying a shovel and a determination that she had not felt in years. The woodshed was a simple structure 20 feet from the back door of the house, built from pine boards and roofed with cedar shakes. It held 3 cords of split oak and 2 cords of pine, enough to last most winters if she was careful. But last most winters was not good enough. Sigrid had lived through enough Dakota winters to know that careful was not always possible. She had seen neighbors run out of wood in February and burn their furniture to stay alive. She had seen families lose fingers and toes to frostbite when their fires went out in the night. She had seen what happened when the cold caught you unprepared. She was not going to let that happen to her. The floor of the woodshed was dirt-packed hard by years of foot traffic. Sigrid started digging at the north end, working in the cool morning hours before the heat of the day made the clay too hard and too punishing. The soil near the surface was dark and rich, full of organic matter that had accumulated over centuries. But at about 18 inches down, it transitioned to a dense gray clay that resisted the shovel like it was made of stone. Clay was, for her purposes, nearly ideal. It does not breathe easily. It does not allow moisture to seep in from the sides. It can be shaped and packed, and once dried, it holds its form with a rigidity that surprises people who have never worked with it. Day after day, Sigrid dug. She worked methodically, carefully, taking breaks when her body demanded them, but always returning to the work before her mind could talk her out of it. She ate breakfast before dawn and dinner after sunset, and in between she moved dirt. The hole she was opening measured 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, roughly the volume of a small bedroom standing on its side. She dug it by hand over the course of 19 days, wheelbarrowing the excavated material to the low ground behind her barn, where it would not be noticed. Approximately 4 tons of earth moved by a 62-year-old woman working alone in a space that nobody had asked for and that everyone assumed she had no reason to need. She kept the woodshed standing above the hole throughout the process, using a system of temporary props made from 8-inch diameter pine poles she had purchased from the mill in Huron, 23 miles to the northwest. The props cost her 60 cents apiece. She used 6 of them. The woodshed floor, which was already elevated on wooden sills, became the ceiling of the chamber below. Sigrid reinforced it by nailing 2 additional layers of 1-inch pine planking across the joists, bringing the total ceiling thickness to just under 4 inches. 4 inches of wood above, 6 feet of air below, and the earth itself on 3 sides, insulating the chamber the way a wool coat insulates a body. Not by generating warmth, but by refusing to let what's already there escape. The first person to notice what Sigrid was doing was Bjorn Thorvald. Bjorn farmed 3 miles to the east on land that his father had homesteaded in 1871. He was 43 years old, thick-bodied and red-faced, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from having never been seriously tested. His farm was larger than Sigrid's, his equipment newer, his barn better built. He had a wife and 5 children, in a position of respect in the settlement that he had done nothing particular to earn. He came by on a Thursday afternoon in late July to borrow a splitting maul. His own had cracked along the handle, and the Thorvald men were not the type to waste good working hours making repairs when they could borrow a tool from a neighbor instead. Sigrid was in the house when she heard him calling from the yard. She went out to meet him and told him the maul was in the woodshed hanging on the north wall. Bjorn walked over to get it, and then he stopped. The hatch Sigrid had cut into the woodshed floor was open. She had been working in the chamber earlier that day, fitting stones into the walls, and she had left the hatch up to let fresh air circulate while she took her midday break. Bjorn stood at the edge of the opening and looked down. He saw the stone floor. He saw the low tunnel opening in the southeast corner. He saw the half-finished firebox at the north end. He saw the S-curve of the flue channel running along the chamber wall. He stared for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, curiosity, and finally something that looked very much like pity. "What exactly do you think that's going to do for you?" Sigrid told him, plainly and without ceremony, the way she told anyone anything. She explained the heat core. She explained the principles behind it. She explained the way her father had built one in Norway 45 years earlier, and the way it had kept their farmhouse warm through winters that would have killed anyone who relied on fire alone. Bjorn listened with the patient expression of a man waiting for something to make sense and failing to find it. When she finished, he nodded slowly, took the splitting maul from its hook on the wall, and thanked her for the loan. His face was carefully neutral, the face of a man who has decided not to say what he's thinking. But Sigrid knew what he was thinking. She could see it in the way he didn't quite meet her eyes as he turned to leave. On his way home, Bjorn stopped at the Grimstad farm, half a mile east of Sigrid's property. He mentioned in the way men mention things when they want to spread information, without appearing to gossip, that the old Norwegian woman had dug herself a fancy hole under her woodshed and seemed to think it would keep her warm through winter. By the following Sunday, 4 different men in the settlement had heard the story. The consensus, delivered with a mixture of good humor and genuine concern, was that Sigrid Kavalin had perhaps spent too many winters alone. The walls of the chamber came next, and this was where the work became something closer to craft. Sigrid spent 4 days traveling along a dry creek bed 3 miles south of her homestead, selecting flat-faced granite cobbles by hand. She was looking for stones with 3 specific qualities: density, flatness on at least 2 faces, and a minimum thickness of 3 inches. Granite was the priority. Sandstone absorbs heat but fractures under rapid temperature change. Limestone holds moisture. Granite does neither. She loaded the stones into her wagon in loads of approximately 800 pounds each. Her draft horse, a 15-year-old Norwegian fjord named Gull, was not built for heavy hauling, but managed the distance without complaint and made 11 trips over the course of a week and a half. By the time she was done, she had accumulated roughly 4,200 pounds of granite cobble in the chamber and along the walls of the pit. She stacked the wall stones dry without mortar, in a technique her father had used and that modern engineers would recognize as a form of dry-stacked thermal mass construction. The gaps between stones were intentional, not large, no more than a quarter inch in most places, but present. They allowed hot air to circulate through the mass during a firing, reaching stones in the interior of the stack, not just the surfaces. The floor of the chamber she paved in a single layer of the flattest stones she had collected, bedded into a 2-inch layer of packed clay that she had mixed with fine creek sand in a ratio of roughly 3-to-1. The surface, when finished, was not smooth, but it was solid and it would not shift under weight. At the north end of the chamber, directly beneath a gap she had left in the woodshed's north wall, Sigrid built the firebox. This was a small, low structure, roughly 30 inches wide, 20 inches tall, and 18 inches deep. She constructed it from the densest granite she had collected and sealed the interior face with a thick plaster of clay and ash mixed together to a consistency she thought of as very stiff bread dough. The firebox had a single opening at the front, sealed with a fitted stone door that could be lifted free and set aside. The combustion gases from a fire in this box did not go up and out through a chimney in the conventional sense. Instead, Sigrid had laid a low flue channel 4 inches tall and 6 inches wide, constructed from flat stones laid in a covered trench that ran from the back of the firebox along the floor of the chamber in a long S-curve. The channel traveled the full 12-foot length of the space before rising through the far wall and exiting through a clay-sealed pipe she had inserted through the woodshed's south wall at ground level. The S-curve was the key. It forced the hot combustion gases to travel 26 linear feet before exiting the chamber. 26 feet of contact between 300-degree exhaust and the granite mass surrounding the flue channel. By the time the gases left the chamber, they were barely warm. The heat had been surrendered to the stone. The final element of the system was the tunnel. Running from the southeast corner of the chamber at floor level was a clay-lined crawl tunnel 30 inches in diameter and 11 feet long that terminated beneath the stone foundation of Sigrid's house, opening into the crawl space under the kitchen floor. Sigrid had sealed the tunnel at both ends with fitted stone plugs that could be removed or inserted by hand. When the plugs were out and the chamber had been fired, warm air from the stone mass would migrate naturally through the tunnel and up through gaps in the kitchen floor. Not in a dramatic rush, but in a slow, steady exhale, the way warm air rises from pavement on a summer afternoon. The temperature differential drove the convection. The kitchen floor directly above the tunnel junction would be, once the system was operating at full capacity, approximately 18 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the ambient outdoor temperature. That number sounds modest. In a blizzard at 40 below, it is the difference between pipes that burst and pipes that hold, between livestock that survive and livestock that freeze standing, between a family that wakes up in the morning and one that does not. She finished the chamber in late September of 1886 as the first cold nights of autumn were beginning to settle over the prairie. The Sunday after Sigrid finished her work, Reverend Nygaard mentioned during the fellowship hour after services that perhaps someone ought to check in on the widow Kvalin. She had not attended church in several months, and there were stories circulating about unusual activities on her property. The settlement's Norwegian Lutheran congregation met in a private home 3 miles east of Sigurd's farm, rotating between the houses of the more prosperous members. Reverend Nygaard was not a trained minister, but a farmer who had studied enough theology to lead services and comfort the dying. He was a kind man in his way, though his kindness was limited by the narrowness of his understanding. "I hear she's been digging," said Martha Grimstad, the wife of the farmer whose property bordered Sigurd's to the south, "down under her woodshed, building some kind of hole." "A cellar, perhaps?" suggested Reverend Nygaard hopefully. "Not a cellar, something else. My husband says it's full of stones, stacked all along the walls, and there's some kind of tunnel going toward her house." The room fell silent. The settlers looked at each other with the expressions of people who have just confirmed something they had suspected for a long time. "She's been alone too long," said Bjorn Thorvald, who was standing near the door with his arms crossed. "Since Ivar died, 5 years now, isn't it? A woman shouldn't be alone that long. It does things to the mind." "Perhaps someone should go speak with her," said Reverend Nygaard. "Offer her fellowship. Remind her that she's not forgotten." Everyone agreed that this was an excellent idea. Someone should definitely go. Someone should absolutely make the effort to reach out to the widow Kvalin and see if she needed help. But when the fellowship hour ended and the families climbed into their wagons and headed home to their Sunday dinners, no one turned their horses toward Sigurd's farm. They had their own fires to tend, their own livestock to feed, their own preparations to make for the winter that everyone could feel coming. The old Norwegian woman would have to take care of herself. That evening, as the sun set over the Dakota prairie and the temperature began its slow descent toward freezing, Sigrid Kvalin sat alone in her kitchen and wrote a letter to her daughter. The letter was not long. Sigrid's letters were never long, but it was more personal than most of her recent correspondence, more intimate in a way that surprised her as she was writing it. She told her daughter about the chamber. She explained what it was and why she had built it. She described the way the stones had felt under her hands as she stacked them, cool and rough and impossibly heavy. She described the smell of the clay as she mixed it with ash to seal the firebox. She described the satisfaction of looking down through the hatch at her completed work and knowing that she had built something that would outlast her. She did not say that she was lonely. She did not say that she missed her daughter so badly some nights that she couldn't breathe. She did not say that she had built the chamber partly because she needed something to do with her hands besides write letters that were never answered. But she hoped in a way she couldn't articulate even to herself that her daughter would understand anyway. She sealed the letter and set it on the table to go out with the next mail wagon. Then she sat for a long time in the gathering darkness, listening to the wind pick up outside and thinking about the winter that was coming. The chamber was ready, the stones were stacked, the flue was clear, the tunnel was sealed. Now all she had to do was wait for the cold to prove her right. October came, and with it, the first real test. On the morning of October 12th, Sigrid walked out to the woodshed as the sun was rising and began preparing for her first firing. She had selected 6 splits of dry oak, each roughly 22 inches long, from the seasoned cordwood she had been setting aside for this purpose. The wood was dense and clean, with no visible rot or moisture, the kind of fuel that burns hot and slow and surrenders its heat without complaint. She opened the hatch in the woodshed floor and descended into the chamber on the ladder she had built for the purpose. The air below was cool and still holding the stable temperature of the earth that surrounded it on 3 sides. Approximately 42 degrees, she estimated. Comfortable enough for working, but not warm. She placed the oak splits in the firebox, arranged them in a loose stack that would allow air to circulate freely, and lit them with a match and a handful of dry grass for tinder. The fire caught quickly, the flames licking at the wood with a hunger that seemed almost impatient. Then she waited. Firing a heat core is not like starting a wood stove. You are not trying to produce immediate warmth. You are trying to transfer energy from the combustion into the mass of the stone slowly and efficiently without wasting it through the flue before it can be absorbed. Sigrid monitored the fire, carefully adjusting the airflow through the firebox opening to keep the burn slow and steady. Too much air and the fire would roar, wasting fuel and sending heat up the flue before the stones could capture it. Too little air and the fire would smolder, producing smoke and unburned gases that would foul the system and reduce efficiency. She used a technique her father had taught her to check the progress. Every hour, she walked to the south end of the chamber and held the back of her hand 1 inch from the flue opening. Warm air meant poor heat transfer. The combustion gases were still carrying energy when they left the system. Cool air meant the stones were doing their job capturing the heat before it could escape. For the first 2 hours, the air at the flue was warm. Not hot, but noticeably above the ambient temperature of the chamber. By the third hour, it was cool enough that she could hold her hand against the opening without discomfort. The stones were taking the heat. She added 2 more splits of oak and let the fire burn for another hour, maintaining the same slow, controlled pace. When she was satisfied that she had transferred as much energy as the fuel would yield, she let the fire die down to embers, sealed the firebox with its stone door, and packed clay around the seam to prevent any remaining gases from entering the chamber. Then she climbed the ladder, closed the hatch, and went inside to wait. 12 hours later, she entered the chamber again. The difference was immediate. The air that had been cool and still the day before was now noticeably warmer, carrying a gentle heat that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Sigrid stood in the center of the space at chest height and breathed deeply. The temperature she estimated was approximately 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the October night had dropped to 29. She stood in that chamber for a longer time and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The stones had done exactly what she had known they would do. The heat that she had put into them 16 hours earlier was still there, bleeding slowly into the air, warming the space with a patience that no fire could match. She thought about her father. She thought about the workshop in Telemark where she had first felt warm stone under her feet on a winter morning. She thought about all the years between then and now, all the miles between Norway and Dakota, all the losses and struggles and small victories that had brought her to this moment. And she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember something that might have been hope. She climbed the ladder and went inside and wrote the longest letter she had sent to her daughter in 4 years. The next morning, Sigrid walked to the junction where the tunnel emerged beneath her kitchen floor. She removed one of the stone plugs, leaving a quarter turn of space open just enough to allow a trickle of warm air to migrate up through the gaps in the floorboards. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Within an hour, the kitchen floor was noticeably warmer than the parlor floor on the other side of the house. By evening, the difference was significant enough that she found herself spending more time in the kitchen than usual, enjoying the gentle warmth that rose from below. Her water pipes, which ran in the crawl space beneath the kitchen, were warm to the touch. That night, the temperature outside dropped to 24 degrees. Sigrid slept better than she had in months. November brought the true cold and Sigrid was ready. She fired the chamber for the second time on November 8th, using 12 splits of oak over 5 hours. The process was the same as before, slow and controlled, monitoring the flue exit until it ran cool, sealing the firebox when the burn was complete. The chamber temperature the following morning was 53 degrees. Outside, the November dawn was 7 degrees above zero. Sigrid left the tunnel plugs partly open, allowing a steady migration of warm air into the kitchen crawl space. The floor above stayed warm. The pipes held. The water in the barrel by the stove remained liquid even on the coldest nights. She used 4 cords of firewood that month, less than she had used in November of 1885. She noted this in a small ledger she kept on a shelf above the kitchen window. The entry was brief. November 1886, chamber fired twice. 4 cords consumed, pipes intact, floor warm. The neighbors did not come to visit. The neighbors did not ask how she was managing. The neighbors were too busy with their own preparations for the winter that everyone knew was coming. But Sigrid didn't mind. She had her work. She had her ledger. She had her chamber full of warm stone beneath the woodshed that everyone had laughed at. And she had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the worst came, as the worst always comes, she would be ready. The winter of 1887 was already sharpening its knives. The old-timers who had lived through the hard years of the 1870s could feel it in their bones, that particular ache that comes when the weather is about to turn murderous. The animals could feel it too. The horses stood with their backs to the north wind, and the cattle clustered together in tight groups, and the dogs buried themselves in straw and refused to come out even for food. Sigrid watched and waited and made her preparations. She brought extra hay into the barn. She checked the seals around every window and door. She split more wood than she needed and stacked it inside the woodshed where the snow couldn't reach it. And she watched Gull, her 15-year-old fjord horse, who had survived more Dakota winters than most of the settlers in the region and who knew things about cold that no human could learn from books. On the morning of January 10th, Gull began pressing herself against the south wall of the barn and would not eat. Sigrid had seen this behavior before. It meant something bad was coming, something worse than a normal winter storm. Something that the horse could sense in the air pressure or the smell of the wind or some other signal that humans were too dull to perceive. She fired the chamber that afternoon. 8 hours, 9 splits of oak, slow and steady and controlled, monitoring the flue until it ran cool, sealing the firebox with clay around the stone door. The chamber temperature that evening was 58 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 14 below zero and falling. 2 days later, the blizzard arrived. The morning of January 12th dawned gray and heavy, with a stillness in the air that felt like the land holding its breath. By noon, the wind had begun to rise. By 2 o'clock, it was screaming. Sigrid stood at her kitchen window and watched the snow drive horizontally across the yard, so thick and fast that she couldn't see the woodshed 20 feet away. The temperature, which had already been 19 below at dawn, continued to drop. The wind, sustained at 32 miles per hour with gusts to 44, created an effective wind chill that brought the felt temperature to somewhere near 50 below zero. The storm would last for 8 days. During that time, Sigrid would not add a single piece of wood to any fire. The chamber would hold. The stones would bleed their warmth into the air with the patience of something geological. The kitchen floor would stay warm while the world outside turned into a killing machine of ice and wind and cold. And somewhere out there, in houses that had been built the conventional way, with wood piles stacked against exterior walls and truss placed in fires that could only burn as long as the fuel held out, her neighbors were beginning to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. The small space under the woodshed was about to say everything that Sigrid Kvalen had never been able to say out loud. The blizzard of January 1887 did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a judgment. On the morning of January 12th, the sky was the color of a bruised purple and gray and swollen with something that wanted to fall. The barometric pressure had been dropping for 2 days, and anyone who knew how to read the signs could feel the weight of what was coming pressing down on their shoulders like an invisible hand. By noon, the first flakes began to fall. They came down soft and slow, at first almost gentle, the kind of snow that children catch on their tongues and poets write verses about. But there was nothing gentle about what followed. The wind arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon. Sigrid knew the exact time because she was standing at her kitchen window when it hit, watching the snow drift lazily across the yard, and she saw the moment when everything changed. 1 second, the flakes were falling at an angle pushed by a moderate breeze. The next second, they were flying horizontally, screaming past the window so fast and thick that the world beyond the glass simply ceased to exist. The sound was like nothing she had ever heard. Not the howl of a wolf, or the roar of a train, or the scream of a wounded animal. Something deeper, something older. The sound of the atmosphere itself tearing apart and putting itself back together again over and over in an endless cycle of destruction and reformation. The temperature, which had been 19 below zero at dawn, began to fall. 20 below, 25, 30. The wind, sustained at 32 miles per hour with gusts to 44, created a wind chill that pushed the felt temperature past 50 below zero. At that level of cold, exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Lungs ache with every breath. The moisture in your eyes crystallizes if you stand facing the wind for too long. Sigrid stepped back from the window and felt the warmth of the kitchen floor through her wool stockings. The chamber was holding. 3 miles to the east, in a house that had been built the same way every house in the settlement had been built, Bjorn Thorvald was beginning to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. His woodpile was stacked against the exterior wall of his house on the north side, where it had been stacked every winter since his father had built the place in 1871. The location made sense in normal weather. It was close to the back door. It was sheltered from the southern sun that could cause premature thawing and refreezing. It was the way things had always been done. But on the morning of January 12th, when Bjorn opened his back door to fetch more wood for the stove, he found himself staring at a wall of white that reached from the ground to the top of the doorframe. The snow had drifted against the north side of the house, 6 feet deep in places, 7 in others. And somewhere underneath that drift, buried and unreachable, was every stick of firewood his family would need to survive the next several days. Bjorn closed the door and stood in the dark hallway, listening to the wind shriek past the windows, feeling the cold already beginning to creep in through the walls. He had perhaps 2 days of wood inside the house, 3 if he was careful. After that, he would have to start burning furniture. At the Nygaard farm 4 miles to the south, Reverend Nygaard was watching ice form on the inside of his windows. His house was the poorest insulated in the settlement, a fact he had accepted with the resigned patience of a man who believed that comfort was a distraction from spiritual matters. The walls were single-thickness pine, the gaps between boards stuffed with rags and newspaper and anything else that might slow the passage of cold air. The roof was cedar shake, weathered and warped with gaps that let in light during the day and starlight at night. In a normal winter, the house was uncomfortable but survivable. The wood stove in the main room could keep the temperature above freezing if it was fed constantly, and Reverend Nygaard and his wife had learned to sleep in shifts, one of them always awake to add wood to the fire. But this was not a normal winter. By the evening of the second day, the temperature inside the house had dropped to 38 degrees, despite a fire burning continuously in the stove. By the morning of the third day, it was 34. On the sixth morning, Reverend Nygaard woke to find a skim of ice on the water barrel in the kitchen, and he knew with terrible certainty that his house was dying around him. He had enough wood to last another week, maybe 2, if he rationed carefully. But it didn't matter how much wood he had if the house couldn't hold the heat. The storm raged without pause for 6 days. On the first day, the settlers hunkered down and waited, assuming that the weather would break by nightfall the way it usually did. Dakota storms were violent but brief. Everyone knew that. The wind would blow itself out, the snow would stop, and life would return to normal. On the second day, the waiting turned to worry. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was intensifying, the wind gusts growing stronger, the temperature continuing its relentless descent. Families began to ration their wood burning less than they needed, accepting discomfort now to avoid catastrophe later. On the third day, the worry turned to fear. Children huddled together under every blanket in the house. Livestock in unheated barns began to suffer. The first reports of frozen pipes reached those families who still had ways to communicate with their neighbors, which was almost no one. On the fourth day, the fear turned to desperation. Bjorn Thorvald burned his last piece of interior stored kindling at noon and stood staring at the family's dining table, calculating how long the wood would last if he broke it apart and fed it to the stove. His wife stood behind him, holding their youngest child against her chest, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. The table would buy them another day. The chairs would add a few more hours. After that, there was the bed frame in the spare room, the shelving in the pantry, the wooden trunk that held their wedding clothes, and the children's christening gowns. They could burn their memories to stay alive. But memories only last so long. On the fifth day, Bjorn made a decision. He woke before dawn, if dawn could even be said to exist in a world where the sky was the same uniform gray at all hours. He lay in the darkness listening to the wind that had not stopped howling for 4 days, and he thought about the old Norwegian woman who lived 3 miles to the west. He thought about the hole she had dug under her woodshed, the stones she had stacked along the walls, the strange system of tunnels and fireboxes and flues that she had tried to explain to him when he came to borrow the splitting maul. He had laughed at her then, not out loud but in his heart. He had thought she was losing her mind the way old people sometimes do when they spend too many years alone with nothing but their thoughts for company. But now, lying in the darkness while his children shivered in their beds and his wife pressed against him for warmth that neither of them had enough of, he found himself remembering something else about Sigrid Kvalen. She always seemed to know something that nobody else did. He had noticed it over the years without really paying attention. The way she would bring in her hay a week before anyone else, and then a storm would come and ruin the hay that was still in the fields. The way she would reinforce her barn roof in the autumn, and then the winter would bring heavier snow than anyone expected. The way she watched the sky and the animals, and the behavior of the wind with an attention that bordered on obsession. She knew things, she had always known things, and maybe, just maybe, the hole under her woodshed wasn't madness at all. Bjorn rose from the bed and began pulling on every piece of clothing he owned. 3 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of trousers, 4 shirts layered one over another. His heaviest coat, the one lined with sheepskin that his father had brought from the old country. A wool scarf wrapped around his face until only his eyes were visible. His wife watched him without speaking. She understood what he was doing. She understood that it might kill him. But she also understood that staying where they were would definitely kill them all, And so she said nothing as he opened the front door and stepped out into the white. The cold hit Bjorn like a physical blow. He had been cold before. Every settler in Dakota Territory had been cold before. But this was something beyond cold. This was the temperature at which the rules of normal existence ceased to apply. The temperature at which metal burns bare skin on contact. The temperature at which spit freezes before it hits the ground. He could not see more than 3 feet in any direction. The snow was not falling anymore. It was flying, driven horizontal by a wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He had lived on this land for 23 years. He knew every fence post, every rise and hollow, every landmark between his property and Sigrid's. But in this white chaos, all of that knowledge was useless. He found the fence by accident, walking into it with his shoulder before he saw it with his eyes. The impact knocked him sideways, and for a moment he lay in the snow, stunned, unsure which direction was up. Then his hand found the wire and he understood. The fence. Follow the fence. Sigrid's property was to the west. The fence ran east to west along the northern boundary of both their claims. If he could keep one hand on the wire and walk until he reached the corner post, he could turn south and follow the next fence line until he reached her house. 3 miles in a blizzard, at 50 below zero. He began to walk. Inside her kitchen, Sigrid was baking bread. The stove was cold. It had been cold for 3 days now. She had not lit it since the morning of January 13th, the day after the storm began. There was no need. The chamber beneath the woodshed was doing exactly what she had built it to do, bleeding warmth up through the tunnel and into the crawl space beneath the kitchen floor. The temperature in the kitchen was 49 degrees, cold enough to see her breath if she exhaled sharply, but warm enough that her water barrel remained liquid. Warm enough that the bread dough would rise slowly if she set it on the floor near the tunnel junction where the heat was strongest. Warm enough that she could work without gloves, could sleep without piling every blanket in the house on top of herself, could exist in something resembling comfort, while the world outside tried its best to kill everything that moved. She had checked the chamber that morning, descending through the hatch in the woodshed floor to inspect the stones and verify that everything was functioning properly. The granite was still warm to the touch, radiating the heat she had put into it 5 days earlier, with the patience of something that understood time in ways that humans never could. She estimated she had another 48 hours of warmth remaining before she would need to fire the chamber again. And even then, she would use only a fraction of the wood that her neighbors were burning every day just to keep from freezing. The mathematics of it were simple and brutal. Her neighbors were spending energy as fast as they could generate it, fighting a losing battle against the cold. She had stored her energy in advance in 4,200 pounds of stone that released it slowly and steadily, without waste, without rush. They were sprinting. She was walking. And in a marathon, the walker always wins. The knock came at 11:37 in the morning. Sigrid heard it over the howl of the wind, a rhythmic pounding that was too regular to be debris striking the door. She set down the bread dough she was kneading and walked to the front of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She opened the door. Bjorn Thorvald stood on her porch, or rather leaned against her porch, because standing seemed to be beyond his current capabilities. His face was raw and red, the skin on his cheeks and nose already showing the white patches of frostbite. His eyes were wild, unfocused, the eyes of a man who has pushed himself past the point of exhaustion and is running on nothing but will. In his arms, wrapped in every blanket his family owned, was his youngest child, a boy of 3, small and still, and so bundled that only his eyes were visible. Bjorn opened his mouth to speak. No words came out. His lips were too frozen, his jaw too stiff from cold, his lungs too damaged from breathing ice for 3 miles. Sigrid said nothing. She stepped back from the doorway and let him in. The warmth hit Bjorn like a wave. He had expected the house to be cold, or at least cool, the way all houses were in weather like this. He had expected to find Sigrid huddled next to a smoking stove, rationing her wood, surviving the same way everyone else was trying to survive. Instead, he walked into a kitchen that felt like spring. The floor beneath his frozen feet was warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, but unmistakably, impossibly warm. He could feel it even through his 3 pairs of socks, through the ice that had formed in the leather of his boots, through the numbness that had spread from his toes to his ankles over the course of his 3-mile walk. He looked down at the floorboards as if expecting to see flames licking up between them. There were no flames. There was no stove burning in the kitchen. There was only the floor and the warmth rising from it in the old Norwegian woman who was already taking his son from his arms and carrying the child toward the heat. Bjorn stood in the center of the kitchen and began to cry. He did not mean to cry. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried when his father died or when his first child was stillborn or when the drought of 1884 destroyed his wheat crop and nearly bankrupted his family. He had been raised to believe that tears were a weakness, a failure of character, an admission that the world was stronger than you were. But standing in that warm kitchen, feeling the heat rise up through his frozen feet, watching Sigrid unwrap his son from the blankets to check for frostbite, he could not stop the tears from coming. They froze on his cheeks almost as soon as they fell. Within 2 hours, 9 people were sheltering in Sigrid's house. First came Bjorn's wife Ingrid and their other 4 children, following the path that Bjorn had broken through the snow. They arrived in a single group roped together to prevent anyone from getting lost in the white, the older children carrying the younger ones who could not walk fast enough to keep their blood warm. Then came the Nygaard family, Reverend Nygaard and his wife and their 2 remaining children, the ones who had survived the fever of 1883. They had seen the Thorvalds' tracks from their kitchen window and followed them without knowing where they led, trusting only that whoever had made those tracks had been going somewhere. Finally, just before dark came 4 strangers. They had been traveling by wagon from Huron to a homestead 40 miles to the north. The storm had caught them in the open on a stretch of road with no shelter within sight. They had abandoned the wagon when their horses collapsed, and they had walked east by instinct, following a fence line that they hoped would lead them to someone's property. It had led them to Sigrid's. She met them at the door the same way she had met Bjorn, with silence and a step backward in an open passage to the warmth inside. They stumbled past her without speaking, too cold and too exhausted for words, and collapsed on the kitchen floor like puppets whose strings had been cut. 9 people, 4 families, 3 of them local, 1 of them strangers who had never heard of Sigrid Kavalan and would never forget her as long as they lived. They would spend the next 8 days in her house. That first night, no one slept. The adults sat in his kitchen pressed close together for warmth that they no longer needed but still craved out of habit. The children lay on the floor near the tunnel junction where the heat rising from below was strongest. The strangers from the wagon, a young couple and an older man and woman who might have been the young man's parents, sat apart from the others, watching everything with the wary eyes of people who do not understand what is happening and are afraid to ask. Sigrid moved among them, quiet and efficient, dispensing blankets and dried meat and water from the barrel that everyone kept expecting to find frozen, and that kept remaining stubbornly liquid. She answered their questions with the minimum words necessary and asked none of her own. At some point, when the wind outside had reached a pitch that made conversation nearly impossible, even indoors, Bjorn Thorvald worked up the courage to ask the question that everyone was thinking. How? Sigrid looked at him. Her face was unreadable. How is this possible? He continued, gesturing at the warm floor, the liquid water, the absence of any fire anywhere in the house. How is it this warm? Where is the heat coming from? Sigrid was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the back door and gestured for Bjorn to follow her. They put on their coats and stepped out into the enclosed passageway that connected the house to the woodshed. Even here in this unheated space, the temperature was noticeably warmer than the outside air. Bjorn could feel it in his lungs, the absence of that knife-edge cold that had nearly killed him on his walk over. Sigrid opened the woodshed door and led him inside. She lit a lantern that hung on the wall and carried it to the center of the floor, where a wooden hatch had been cut into the boards. She lifted the hatch. Below, in the flickering light of the lantern, Bjorn saw the chamber. He saw the stone walls stacked dry, the gaps between them dark with shadow. He saw the floor of flat granite worn smooth by Sigrid's feet. He saw the S-curve of the flue channel running along the north wall, and the sealed firebox at the far end, and the tunnel opening in the southeast corner that led beneath the house. And he felt the warmth rising up from below, a gentle heat that seemed to radiate from the stones themselves, as if they were alive, as if they were breathing. My father built one in Norway, Sigrid said. It was the most words she had spoken at once since Bjorn had arrived. In 1841, after a winter that killed 11 horses and collapsed the church roof. He learned it from his father, who learned it from a builder in Bergen, who learned it from the Romans. Bjorn stared at her. The Romans? They heated their bathhouses this way 2,000 years ago. Hot air under the floor. The stones hold the heat and release it slowly. For days. For weeks, if you build it right. But I saw you building this. Bjorn's voice was barely a whisper. Last summer, I saw the stones. I saw the tunnel. I asked you what it was for, and you told me, He couldn't finish the sentence. Sigrid finished it for him. You laughed. The word hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor forgiveness, simply a statement of fact. Bjorn had laughed. Everyone had laughed. They had laughed and walked away and stacked their cordwood against their walls the same way their fathers had, and now three of them were huddled in Sigrid's kitchen while the storm tried to kill everything it could reach. Bjorn looked down at the chamber, at the stones that were keeping his family alive, at the work that Sigrid had done alone while everyone around her had written her off as a madwoman. Teach me, he said. Sigrid looked at him for a long moment. Her face illuminated by the lantern light was impossible to read. Then she nodded once and closed the hatch. The storm raged for 8 days. In the world beyond Sigrid's farm, it was killing with methodical efficiency. Cattle froze standing in their pastures, their bodies found weeks later in the exact positions they had occupied at the moment of death, like statues carved from ice. A barn belonging to Olaf Stenrude, 4 miles to the east, collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. A structure that had been standing for 11 years, reduced to kindling in a single night. Water sources froze solid, leaving families without drinking water, without water for their livestock, without any way to survive except by melting snow over fires that consumed wood faster than anyone had planned for. 3 families were trapped for the entire duration of the storm without the ability to reach their woodpiles, which had been buried under 6 feet of drifted snow within 36 hours of the blizzard's onset. They burned furniture. They burned books. They burned the wooden toys that had been carved for children who were now old enough to understand that survival sometimes requires sacrifice. But inside Sigrid's house, life continued with something approaching normalcy. She fired the chamber twice during the 8 days using a total of 21 splits of oak, less wood than Bjorn's family had burned in a single day before their supply ran out. Less wood than Reverend Nygaard's stove consumed in 12 hours, while still failing to keep the house warm. The 9 people who sheltered with her ate from her root cellar and her smoked meat provisions she had laid in for a single woman's winter, but that stretched further than anyone expected, because Sigrid Kvalin did not believe in waste. They slept on her floors, children and adults alike arranged in rows like logs covered with every blanket and coat and piece of fabric that could be spared. And they talked, not at first. At first, they were too exhausted, too cold, too shocked by what they had survived to do anything except exist. But by the 3rd day, when it became clear that the storm was not going to break anytime soon and that they were going to be spending considerable time in each other's company, the talking began. Reverend Nygaard talked about faith, about the ways that God tests his children, about the lessons that could be learned from suffering if only one had the wisdom to see them. His words were meant to comfort, but they landed with a heaviness that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Bjorn Thorvald talked about practicalities, about what needed to be done when the storm finally ended, about how they would dig out their farm's salvage, what could be salvaged, rebuild what needed rebuilding. His words were the words of a man who needed to feel useful even when there was nothing useful to be done. The strangers from the wagon talked very little. They listened. They watched. They ate the food that Sigrid offered them and slept on the floor she provided and said thank you in voices that trembled with an emotion that went beyond gratitude. And Sigrid herself talked hardly at all. She moved through her house like a ghost tending to the fire in the chamber, checking the tunnel plugs, distributing food and water with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. She answered questions when asked, but volunteered nothing. She showed Bjorn the chamber twice more during those 8 days, pointing out details he had missed the first time, explaining the principles behind the construction in short, precise sentences that wasted no words. But she did not share stories. She did not reminisce. She did not speak about her husband or her daughter or the years she had spent alone on this land, building something that everyone had dismissed as the fantasy of a lonely old woman. She simply kept them alive. On the morning of the 7th day, Bjorn found Sigrid standing alone in the woodshed, looking down at the closed hatch. The wind had died somewhat during the night, dropping from a constant howl to an intermittent moan. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, and for the first time in nearly a week, There were brief moments when you could see more than 10 feet in any direction. Bjorn stood in the doorway watching her. She didn't turn around. "Why did you let us in?" he asked. Sigrid was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Would you have let me freeze?" Bjorn opened his mouth to answer and found that he couldn't, because the truth was he didn't know. He had never thought about it. He had never imagined a scenario in which Sigrid Kvalin would need his help, because she had always seemed so completely self-sufficient, so thoroughly capable of surviving whatever the world threw at her. And because, if he was being honest with himself, he had never thought about her much at all. She was the old Norwegian woman who lived alone on the claim to the west. She was the widow who kept to herself and didn't come to church and didn't participate in the social life of the settlement. She was the person you borrowed tools from when you needed them and returned them without conversation because she didn't seem to want conversation. She was in the minds of everyone who knew her barely a person at all, just a fixture of the landscape, just part of the background, just someone who had always been there and presumably always would be, requiring nothing and offering nothing except the occasional use of a well-maintained splitting maul, and now she was the only reason his family was still alive. "I don't know," Bjorn admitted. "I'd like to think I would have, but I don't know." Sigrid nodded as if this was exactly the answer she had expected. "The cold is not the enemy," she said. "Ignorance of the cold is the enemy. My father told me that when I was 11 years old. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now." She turned to face him, and for the first time since he had arrived, Bjorn saw something in her eyes that wasn't distance or self-sufficiency or the careful blankness of a woman who had learned not to need anyone. He saw grief. "I built this for my son," she said, "the one I sent to Minnesota. I thought that if I built something useful, something that would last, he might come back someday to see it, to see what his mother had made, to see that she wasn't just an old woman losing her mind in the middle of nowhere." She paused and Bjorn saw her jaw tighten. "He doesn't write anymore. Not for 2 years now. I don't even know if he reads my letters. But I keep building, I keep preparing, because that's what my father taught me to do, and because there's nothing else left." Bjorn stood in the doorway not knowing what to say. There was nothing to say. Nothing that would fix what was broken in this woman's life. Nothing that would bring back her son or her husband or the years she had spent alone, working without recognition, building without acknowledgement, surviving without anyone noticing that surviving was exactly what she was doing. So he said the only thing he could think of. "When this is over," he said, "teach me how to build one of these for my family, for anyone else who wants to learn. Teach us what your father taught you." Sigrid looked at him for a long time, and then slowly she nodded. "The stone comes from the creek bed 3 miles south," she said. "You'll want granite, not sandstone. Sandstone fractures in the cold. The walls go up dry, no mortar. The gaps are intentional. They let the heat circulate." She continued talking, explaining the principles of the heat core in more detail than she had shared with anyone since she was a girl listening to her father in a workshop in Norway. And Bjorn listened, really listened in a way he had not listened to anything in years. The wind picked up again outside, howling around the corners of the woodshed like something angry and alive. But inside, in the warmth that rose from the stones, a kind of peace had settled over both of them. The storm broke on January 20th. It didn't end gradually the way most storms do. It ended all at once as if someone had thrown a switch. One moment the wind was blowing and the snow was falling and the world was white. The next moment the sky was clear and blue, and the sun was shining with a brightness that hurt the eyes after so many days of gray. Sigrid stood on her porch and looked out at what the storm had done. The snow was piled in drifts that reached the eaves of the barn in places. The path to the woodshed had disappeared, entirely buried under 4 feet of white that sparkled in the morning light like someone had scattered diamonds across the landscape. The fence posts that marked the boundary of her property were invisible. The wires lost somewhere beneath the surface, and the only landmarks visible were the tops of buildings and the bare branches of the few trees that had survived the last 15 years of Dakota winters. The 9 people who had sheltered with her emerged from the house one by one, blinking in the sunlight, their faces pale and their eyes red from too many sleepless nights in close quarters. They stood on the porch beside her, looking at the white world, saying nothing. There would be work to do, digging out, checking on livestock, assessing damage, finding out who had survived and who had not. The settlement would need to come together to help each other to rebuild what the storm had destroyed. But for now, for just this moment, they stood in silence and watched the sun rise over the snow. Bjorn Thorvald was the first to speak. "We should check the others," he said. "The Stenruds, the Halvorsons, the families closer to town." Sigrid nodded. "Go," she said. "I'll be here when you get back." Bjorn looked at her. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there 8 days ago. Respect, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper. Something that didn't have a name. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Sigrid said nothing. She simply nodded once and turned to go back inside. The settlement dug itself out over the following week. The news as it emerged was bad. 7 cattle dead across the region. 2 barn roofs compromised, including Olaf Stenrud's, which had collapsed entirely. One family had spent 4 days in their barn because their house had become too cold to survive in. 3 families had burned significant portions of their furniture. Everyone was exhausted, traumatized, diminished in ways that would take months or years to fully understand. But no one had died. The settlement gathered at the Thorvald farm on the Sunday after the storm broke. It wasn't a formal meeting, just a coming together, a need to see each other's faces and confirm that everyone was still alive. The conversation turned with some difficulty and some silence to the question of what Sigrid Kvalin had built. "She kept 9 people alive for 8 days, Bjorn said, without burning more wood than I use in a single morning. Her pipes didn't freeze. Her water didn't ice over. Her floor was warm when everything else was cold." The others listened without interrupting. Some of them had been there in Sigrid's kitchen, and they knew he was telling the truth. Others had heard the stories, but hadn't believed them. "She built a chamber under her woodshed," Bjorn continued, "filled it with stones, ran a tunnel to her house. The stones hold heat like nothing I've ever seen. She fires it once, maybe twice a week, and the warmth lasts for days." "Sounds like witchcraft," someone muttered. It might have been meant as a joke. It didn't sound like one. "It's not witchcraft," Bjorn said. His voice was sharp. "It's knowledge. Her father built one in Norway 50 years ago. His father built one before that. It's old, older than any of us, and it works." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. No one wanted to be the first to admit that they had been wrong about Sigrid, that they had laughed at her, that they had talked about her behind her back as if she were losing her mind, when in fact she had been the only one among them who truly understood what they were facing. Finally, Reverend Nygaard spoke. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should ask her to teach us." The vote was unanimous. Bjorn rode out to Sigrid's farm that afternoon. He found her in the woodshed inspecting the stones for any damage the storm might have caused. She looked up when he entered but didn't stop working. "The settlement wants to know if you'll teach them," he said, "how to build these chambers, heat cores, whatever you call them." Sigrid was quiet for a moment. Then she set down the stone she had been examining and stood up. "I'll need help with the heavy work," she said. "My back isn't what it used to be." "You'll have it," Bjorn said. "As much as you need, as many men as you want. We'll quarry the stone, dig the chambers, do whatever you tell us to do." Sigrid nodded slowly. "The first one will take a month," she said. "After that, faster, once people understand what they're doing." "How many can we build before next winter?" Sigrid thought about it. "Well," she said, "maybe 6. If the summer is long and the stone holds out." "Then we'll build 5, Bjorn said. "Or 6, starting with the families that need it most. The Nygaards, the Stenruds, anyone with children or elderly parents or houses that can't hold heat." Sigrid looked at him for a long time. Her face, as always, was difficult to read. "Why do you care?" she asked. "A month ago you thought I was a crazy old woman." Bjorn didn't flinch from the question. He owed her that much. "A month ago," he said, "I was a fool who almost killed his family because he was too proud to listen to someone who knew more than he did." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I can't change what I thought before, but I can change what I do now. And what I'm doing now is asking you to help us, not because we deserve it, but because you're the only one who can." Sigrid studied his face for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Bjorn had known her, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a forgiving smile. It was the smile of a woman who had waited a very long time to hear someone say what Bjorn had just said, and who was not quite ready to believe that she had heard it. but it was a smile. "Spring," she said. "When the ground thaws. We'll start then." Bjorn nodded. "Spring," he agreed. He turned to go, then stopped at the doorway. "The settlement is taking up a collection," he said, "to pay you for your time, for your knowledge. It won't be much, but—" "I don't want your money," Sigrid interrupted. "I want something else." "Name it." Sigrid was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When this is done, when the chambers are built and the winter comes and everyone survives, I want you to write it down. Everything, how they're built, why they work, the measurements, the materials, the techniques. I want you to write it down and send it to the land office in Huron so that anyone who wants to learn can learn." Bjorn nodded. "I'll do it myself," he said. "Good," Sigrid said, "because I won't be here forever. And when I'm gone, I want this to last. I want it to matter. I want people to know that there was a way, even if they never knew there was a woman who showed them." She turned back to her stones and Bjorn understood that the conversation was over. He walked back to his horse and rode home through the melting snow, thinking about chambers and stone and the strange, quiet woman who had saved his life. That spring, they built the first one. Bjorn Thorvald commissioned a heat core for his own property, working under Sigrid's supervision from the day the ground thawed until the first heat of summer made the work unbearable. 3 other families followed. By autumn, 5 properties in the settlement had functioning thermal mass chambers beneath their woodsheds or barns, all built to Sigrid's specifications, all lined with river granite, all connected to the main living spaces by clay-sealed crawl tunnels with removable stone plugs. The Huron Weekly Plainsman ran a brief item in October of 1887, noting that a Norwegian-born homesteader near the James River had developed an unusual but apparently effective heating system based on methods used in Scandinavia, and that several local families had adopted it in advance of what farmers and herders were already predicting would be another severe winter. The item was 4 sentences long and ran on page 3. But Sigrid didn't care about the newspaper. She cared about the chambers. She cared about the families who would survive because of what she had taught them. She cared about the knowledge that was spreading slowly but surely from one homestead to the next. And she cared, though she would never have admitted it, about the fact that for the first time in 5 years, she was not alone. The winter of 1887 to 1888 arrived with a fury that made the previous year's storms look gentle. Sigrid felt it coming in early January, the same way she had felt it the year before. The barometric pressure dropping, the animals growing restless, the sky taking on that bruised, swollen look that meant something bad was building beyond the horizon. She fired her chamber on January 10th, the same day Bjorn Thorvald and Reverend Nygaard and the 3 other families who now had heat cores did the same. 2 days later, the school children's blizzard struck. It would become the most famous storm in Dakota history. The storm that killed hundreds. The storm that buried children on their way home from school, that trapped families in their homes for weeks, that froze cattle by the thousands, and broke the back of the open-range cattle industry that had been building since the end of the Civil War. But in the settlement near the James River, where 5 families had followed a quiet old woman's instructions and built chambers of stone beneath their woodsheds, no one died. Not one person. The storm raged. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. The wind reached 70 miles per hour before the instruments stopped recording. And in 5 houses scattered across 20 square miles of Dakota prairie, the floors stayed warm and the pipes held, and the families survived. 3 of those 5 families took in neighbors during the worst days of the storm, sheltering people who had not built chambers, who had not listened, who had laughed at the idea the same way everyone had laughed at Sigrid the summer before. And Sigrid herself, in the house where it had all begun, took in 9 people again. Different people this time. 4 of them strangers who had been caught on the road just like the year before. Following fence lines, following tracks in the snow, following the rumor of warmth that had spread through the region over the past 12 months, following it to the small space under the woodshed. On the last night of the storm, when the wind had finally begun to die, and the worst was clearly over, Sigrid sat alone in her kitchen and wrote a letter to her son. She did not know if he would read it. She did not know if he even received her letters anymore. But she wrote anyway the same way she had written for 5 years because writing was the only connection she had left to the boy she had sent away. She told him about the storm, about the chamber that had kept her alive, about the 5 families who had built their own chambers and the people they had saved. She told him about Bjorn Thorvald, who had laughed at her once and now called her the wisest person he knew. She told him about the newspaper article 4 sentences on page 3 that was the only public recognition she would ever receive. And she told him about the thing she had learned, the thing that her father had tried to teach her 50 years ago in a workshop in Norway, the thing that she finally truly understood. The cold is not the enemy. Ignorance of the cold is the enemy. But there is another kind of ignorance, she wrote. The ignorance of not knowing what you have until it's gone. The ignorance of sending away the people you love because you think you're protecting them. The ignorance of spending your whole life building things for someone who may never come back to see them. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. I don't know if you'll read this, she continued. I don't know if you'll ever come back to Dakota. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for sending you away, or understand why I did it, or believe me when I say that not a day has passed when I didn't think of you. But I want you to know that everything I've built here, I built for you. The chamber under the woodshed, the tunnels, the stone walls that hold heat like memory, holds love. All of it. For you. And even if you never see it, even if you never come back, even if this letter ends up in a drawer somewhere and never gets opened, I want you to know one more thing. Stone does not forget warmth as easily as people forget what they owe to each other. But I have not forgotten you. Not for one single moment. Not ever. She signed the letter and sealed it and set it aside to go out with the next mail wagon. Then she sat in the warm kitchen, listening to the wind die down outside and waited for spring. The morning after the school children's blizzard finally broke, the sun rose over Dakota Territory like an apology. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at. The snow piled in drifts that reached the roof lines of barns and buried fence posts entirely sparkled with a brilliance that seemed almost cruel after so many days of gray. The temperature had climbed to 5 degrees above zero, which felt practically tropical compared to the 50 below that had gripped the land for nearly 2 weeks. Sigrid stood on her porch at dawn, wrapped in a wool shawl that had belonged to her mother, and watched the light spread across the white landscape. Behind her in the house that had sheltered 9 strangers through the worst storm in living memory, she could hear the sounds of people beginning to stir. Children coughing, adults murmuring, the creak of floorboards as someone walked to the water barrel that had remained liquid throughout the entire ordeal. The chamber had held. Again. She had fired it twice during the storm, using a total of 18 splits of oak. Less wood than most families burned in a single day, while still watching their houses grow colder by the hour. The stones beneath the woodshed had done exactly what she had asked them to do, absorbing heat during the brief hours of the firing and releasing it slowly, steadily, patiently over the days that followed. The kitchen floor was still warm beneath her feet. Sigrid closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of something that might have been satisfaction. Not pride. She had never been comfortable with pride. But satisfaction, yes. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that what she had built with her own hands in a space that everyone had dismissed as useless had proven itself against the worst that the land could offer. Then she opened her eyes and went inside to feed the people who had trusted her with their lives. The news from the wider world arrived in pieces over the following weeks. It came on the backs of horses, ridden by men with frostbitten faces. It came in letters that had been delayed by impassable roads. It came in the hushed conversations of survivors who made their way from farm to farm, sharing what they had seen, what they had heard, what they could not bring themselves to believe. The school children's blizzard had earned its name. Across Dakota Territory, across Nebraska and Minnesota and Iowa, children had died walking home from school. The storm had struck in the early afternoon, arriving with such sudden ferocity that teachers had been forced to make impossible choices. Keep the children inside where the buildings might not survive the night, or send them home into a white wall of death that swallowed everything it touched. Some teachers had kept their students. Some had let them go. Some had tied the children together with rope and led them in lines through the snow, praying that instinct would guide them to safety when sight had failed entirely. Many of those children were never found until spring. The stories that emerged were almost too terrible to process. A boy of 8 discovered frozen 300 yards from his family's barn, so close to safety that his father could see the barn door from where the body lay. A girl of 12 who had made it home only to find the house empty, her parents having gone out to search for her, all three of them dying within a mile of each other. A teacher who had kept her students alive for 36 hours in a schoolhouse with no heat burning the desks and chairs, and finally the books to keep the fire going, only to lose three of them to frostbite and exposure in the end. The death toll, when it was finally calculated, reached into the hundreds. And the cattle died by the tens of thousands. The open-range industry that had been building across the northern plains since the end of the Civil War collapsed in a single winter, destroyed not by economics or competition, but by the simple, brutal mathematics of cold. 1 million head of cattle froze on the Dakota plains that winter. 1 million animals standing stiff in their pastures like monuments to human hubris, to the belief that the land could be conquered, that the weather could be predicted, that preparation was something other people needed to worry about. Sigrid listened to these stories and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The dead were dead. The survivors would survive. And the lessons that should have been learned would be forgotten by the next generation, just as they had been forgotten by this one. That was the way of things. That had always been the way of things. But in the settlement near the James River, where 5 families had built chambers of stone beneath their woodsheds, not a single person had died. Not one child, not one elder, not one stranger who had stumbled to their doors seeking shelter from the white. That was something. That was worth remembering. February brought the thaw, and with it the work of rebuilding. The settlement gathered at the Thorvald farm on the first Sunday after the roads became passable, not for church services, but for something more practical. They needed to assess the damage. They needed to plan for spring. They needed to figure out how to prevent what had happened from ever happening again. 11 men sat around Bjorn Thorvald's kitchen table, their faces weathered by cold and exhaustion, their hands wrapped around cups of coffee that Ingrid Thorvald kept refilling without being asked. The conversation was halting at first, as conversations always are when people have seen too much and understood too little. But eventually, inevitably, the talk turned to Sigrid Kvalin. 5 houses, Bjorn said. 5 chambers, all of them held. Every family that built one survived without losing a single person. The others nodded. They had heard the stories. Some of them had lived the stories, sheltering in chambers they had built with their own hands, under Sigrid's supervision, watching their neighbors struggle while their own floor stayed warm. The question is what we do now, Bjorn continued. We can rebuild the barns. We can replace the cattle. We can fix the damage the storm did to our homes, but none of that matters if we don't address the real problem. Which is, someone asked. Ignorance, Bjorn said. We didn't know what we were facing. We didn't know how to prepare. We stacked our wood against our walls like our fathers did, because that's how it had always been done, and we never stopped to ask if there was a better way. He paused, looking around the table at the faces of men who had known him for years, who had worked beside him and worshipped beside him and buried their dead beside him. Sigrid knew, he said. She tried to tell us, and we laughed at her. The silence that followed was heavy with shame. No one wanted to be the first to admit it. No one wanted to acknowledge that they had dismissed the old woman's warnings, had talked about her behind her back, had assumed that she was losing her mind, when in fact she had been the only one among them who understood what they were facing. Finally, Reverend Nygaard spoke. We should write it down, he said. Everything she taught us. The dimensions of the chambers, the type of stone, the way the tunnels connect to the houses. All of it. We should write it down and send it to the county land office so that anyone who wants to learn can learn. I already promised her I would, Bjorn said, before the storm. She asked me to do it, and I gave her my word. Then we'll help you, said another man. We'll draw diagrams, we'll take measurements, we'll make it so clear that even a fool could follow the instructions. And we'll sign it, Reverend Nygaard added. All of us. We'll put our names on the document and recommend that the county make it available to every homesteader who asks. The vote was unanimous. 11 men, 11 signatures, 11 acknowledgments that they had been wrong, and Sigrid Kvalin had been right. It was not an apology. The word was never spoken. But it was the closest thing to an apology that men like these knew how to give. The letter to the county land office was drafted over the following 2 weeks. Bjorn wrote the main text describing the heat core system in plain, practical language that any farmer could understand. He included measurements, materials lists, and step-by-step instructions that covered everything from digging the chamber to firing the stones for the first time. He drew diagrams showing the S-curve of the flue channel, the placement of the firebox, the angle at which the tunnel should rise to connect with the house. The other men reviewed his work, suggesting corrections and additions based on their own experiences building chambers under Sigurd's supervision. They argued about details about whether the gaps between stones should be a quarter inch or 3/8, about whether granite was truly superior to other types of rock, or whether local availability should be the primary consideration. In the end, they produced a document of 7 pages handwritten in Bjorn's careful script, signed by 11 men whose names were known throughout the settlement. The cover letter was addressed to the county assessor in Huron. We, the undersigned residents of the James River settlement, hereby recommend that the attached instructions be documented and made available to any homesteader who requests them. The system described herein was developed by Mrs. Sigrid Kvalin of this settlement based on methods taught to her by her father in Norway. It has been tested through 2 severe winters, including the blizzard of January 1888, and has proven effective in maintaining survivable temperatures in homes and outbuildings without the excessive consumption of fuel. We believe that widespread adoption of this system could save lives and reduce suffering among the settlers of Dakota Territory, and we respectfully request that the county take appropriate action to disseminate this information. The letter was sealed and sent to Huron, with the next mail wagon arriving sometime in late February of 1888, slightly crumpled from the journey but otherwise intact. Whether any official action was taken on its recommendation is unclear. No formal record has been located in the archives of the Huron Land Office or in any other government repository. The letter may have been filed and forgotten. It may have been dismissed as the eccentric notion of a group of farmers who had been frightened by a bad winter and were grasping at any solution that presented itself. Or it may simply have been lost, as so many documents from that era were lost to fire or flood, or the simple indifference of clerks who had too much paper to process and too little time to process it. What is certain is that the instructions were never officially distributed. The heat core system never became standard practice across Dakota Territory. The knowledge that Sigrid Kvalin had carried from Norway, that her father had carried before her, that had been passed down through generations of builders who understood cold in ways that most people never would, remain confined to the small settlement near the James River. A few families in neighboring areas heard about the system and traveled to the settlement to learn. A few more read about it in the Huron Weekly Plainsman, that 4-sentence article on page 3, and wrote letters asking for more information. But the spread was slow and the memories were short, and by the time the next generation came of age, most of what Sigrid had taught had been forgotten. That was the way of things. That had always been the way of things. The spring of 1888 was wet and cold, delaying planting and extending the season of mud that turned every road into an obstacle course. Sigrid spent most of March and April in her house reading and writing and watching the snows slowly melt from the fields that surrounded her property. She wrote to her son every 2 weeks, as she always had, though the letters had begun to feel more like conversations with herself than communications with another person. She did not expect replies. She had not expected replies for more than 2 years now. But she kept writing anyway, because writing was the only connection she had left to the boy she had sent away, and because stopping would have felt like admitting that he was never coming back. The summer brought visitors. Bjorn Thorvald came by regularly, ostensibly to check on her, but really she suspected to seek her advice on matters that had nothing to do with heat cores or stone chambers. He had become something like a friend over the past year, though Sigrid was not sure she remembered how friendship worked. It had been so long since she had allowed anyone to get close. Reverend Nygaard came once a month to offer spiritual counsel that Sigrid did not want and did not request. She tolerated his visits with patient silence, nodding at appropriate intervals, while he talked about faith and redemption and the mysterious ways of God. She did not tell him that she had stopped believing in God the year her husband died, or that she had stopped believing in redemption the year she sent her son away. Some things were better left unsaid. Other settlers came too, some to thank her for what she had taught them, some to ask questions about maintenance and repair, some simply to see the famous chamber that had kept 9 people alive through the worst storm in Dakota history. Sigrid showed them all the same thing: the hatch in the woodshed floor, the stone walls stacked dry, the S-curve of the flue channel, the tunnel that connected to the house. She explained the principles patiently, repeatedly, knowing that most of them would forget half of what she said before they reached their own properties. But a few would remember, a few would pass the knowledge to their children. And maybe someday, one of those children would build a chamber of their own and save lives that would otherwise have been lost. That was enough. It had to be enough. The autumn of 1888 brought a letter from Minnesota. Sigrid found it in her mailbox on a gray October afternoon, mixed in with a notice from the land office about property taxes and a circular advertising farm equipment that she had no intention of buying. The envelope was addressed in handwriting she did not recognize, but the return address was familiar. Her cousin Birgitte's house, where her son had been living for the past 5 years. She stood in the yard for a long time holding the envelope, afraid to open it. Letters from that address had never brought good news. The last one, more than 2 years ago, had been a brief note in her son's handwriting, 3 sentences that said nothing and meant everything. I am well. I have work. Please do not write so often. She had kept writing anyway, but she had not received another reply. Now holding this new envelope, she felt the weight of all the letters she had sent pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. All the words she had poured out, all the news she had shared, all the love she had tried to express in sentences that felt inadequate, even as she wrote them. She opened the envelope. The letter was from Birgitte, not from her son. It was brief and formal, the tone of someone delivering news that they did not want to deliver. Dear Sigrid, I am writing to inform you that your son Leif has married. The ceremony took place last month in St. Paul. His wife's name is Anna, and she is the daughter of a merchant family here. Leif asked me not to write to you about this. He said he would tell you himself when he was ready. But I felt you had a right to know, and I have always believed that mothers should not be kept in the dark about the important events in their children's lives. I do not know when or if he will contact you. He speaks of you rarely, and when he does, there is a distance in his voice that I cannot explain and do not fully understand. I believe he loves you in his way. But I also believe that something happened between you that he has not forgiven, and I do not know if he ever will. I am sorry to be the one to tell you this. I hope that time will heal whatever wounds exist between you. Your cousin Birgit. Sigrid read the letter 3 times, standing in her yard with the October wind cutting through her shawl. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and walked inside. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time, looking at nothing. Her son was married. Her son had started a family. Her son had asked his cousin not to tell her about it because he did not want her to know. She thought about the letters she had written, hundreds of them over 5 years. She thought about the heat course she had built, the one she had described in such detail in letter after letter, hoping that someday he would come back to see it. She thought about the words she had written on the last night of the school children's blizzard, the confession of love and regret that she had sealed and sent without knowing if it would ever be read. Stone does not forget warmth as easily as people forget what they owe to each other. But she had forgotten something too. She had forgotten that the decision she made in 1883 to send her son away had consequences that she could not undo. She had forgotten that protecting someone and pushing them away can feel like the same thing to the person being pushed. She had forgotten that love unexpressed and unrequited can curdle into something that looks a lot like abandonment. She had spent 5 years building things for a son who was not coming back. And now she understood with a clarity that felt like being struck by lightning that she had been building for herself all along. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was mild by Dakota standards. The storms that came were ordinary, manageable, the kind of weather that settlers had learned to survive without extraordinary measures. The chambers that had been built throughout the settlement functioned as designed, keeping houses warm and pipes intact, but they were not tested the way they had been tested the year before. Sigrid fired her chamber 4 times that winter. She ate meals alone. She wrote letters that she no longer expected to be answered. She read books that had been read so many times the spines were cracked and the pages were soft with handling. And she began slowly and without conscious intention to prepare for the end. Not death. She was not dying, not yet, not in any way that she could perceive. But she was 64 years old and she had been alone for 7 years, and she understood with the practical clarity that had always been her greatest strength that she would not live forever. The question was what she would leave behind. The farm would go to her son whether he wanted it or not. The land, the house, the barn, the woodshed, the chamber beneath it. All of it would become his when she was gone, and assuming he could be located and notified of her passing. If he could not be found, the property would revert to the county and everything she had built would be forgotten within a generation. She did not want to be forgotten. It was not pride that drove this desire. Sigrid had never cared about recognition or fame or the admiration of her neighbors. She had built the heat core because it needed building, because the knowledge existed in her head and the materials existed in the ground, and the winter was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. But she had also built it because she believed that knowledge should not die with the person who carries it. Because she had watched her father build a heat core in Norway 50 years ago and had understood even as a child that what he was teaching her was important. Because she knew that somewhere in some future she would never see, there would be people who needed what she knew and had no way to learn it. She began to write. The document she produced over the following months was not long. 3 pages in Norwegian, her native language, the language in which she could express herself most precisely. She wrote about the chamber, of course, the dimensions, the materials, the techniques. But she also wrote about the principles behind the construction, the reasons why each element was necessary, the logic that connected the firebox to the flue channel, to the tunnel, to the warm floor of the house above. She wrote about her father, Torsten Kavalen, who had built the first heat core she ever saw in the valley outside Kviteside in 1841. She wrote about his father, who had learned the technique from a builder in Bergen, who had studied Roman hypocaust systems in books that had survived for 2,000 years. And she wrote about herself. Not much, just enough to explain who she was and why she had built what she had built and what she hoped it would mean to whoever read these words after she was gone. The cold is not the enemy, she wrote. Ignorance of the cold is the enemy. My father taught me that when I was 11 years old. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. She ended the document with a single sentence that she labored over for 3 days, writing and rewriting until every word felt exactly right. Stone does not forget warmth as easily as people forget what they owe to each other. She folded the pages carefully and placed them in an envelope. On the outside of the envelope, in her careful handwriting, she wrote "for Leaf." Then she placed the envelope in the tin box under her bed, along with all the letters her son had sent her over the years, and she closed the lid and pushed the box back into the darkness, where it would wait for whatever came next. The years that followed were quiet ones. Sigrid continued to farm, though her body was beginning to fail her in small ways that she noticed but did not acknowledge. Her knees ached when she climbed the ladder into the chamber. Her hands shook slightly when she wrote her letters. Her eyes, which had always been sharp, began to blur at the edges, making it difficult to read in the dim light of winter afternoons. She hired help when she needed it, young men from the settlement who came to split wood or mend fences or perform other tasks that she could no longer do herself. She paid them fairly and fed them well and sent them home without conversation because she had never learned to make conversation, and it was too late to start now. The settlement continued to grow. New families arrived from the east, drawn by promises of cheap land and fresh starts. Some of them heard about the heat cores and asked to learn. Sigrid taught them the same way she had taught the others, with patience and precision and the absolute minimum of wasted words. By 1890, there were 11 chambers in the settlement. By 1891, there were 14. Each one built to Sigrid's specifications. Each one lined with river granite. Each one connected to its house by clay-sealed tunnels with removable stone plugs. Each one a small monument to the knowledge that a quiet old woman had carried from Norway and shared with anyone who was willing to listen. The pneumonia came in January of 1891. Sigrid felt it first as a tightness in her chest, a difficulty breathing, that she attributed to the cold air and the exertion of walking to the woodshed. She ignored it for 3 days the way she had always ignored physical discomfort, telling herself that it would pass if she rested and drank enough water and kept herself warm. It did not pass. By the 4th day, she could not get out of bed. The fever had come, and with it the coughing that brought up fluid from her lungs, fluid that was pink at first, and then red, and then a color she did not want to look at. Bjorn Thorvald found her on the 5th day when he came by to check on her and discovered the door unlocked and the house cold, and Sigrid lying in her bed, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored. He rode to Huron for the doctor, pushing his horse harder than he had ever pushed it, but by the time they returned, it was clear that there was nothing to be done. The pneumonia had settled too deep. The infection had spread too far. The body that had survived 67 Dakota winters was finally surrendering to an enemy it could not defeat. Sigrid died on the 8th day just as the sun was setting. She was not alone. Bjorn was there and Ingrid, his wife, and Reverend Nygaard, who said the words that needed saying, even though Sigrid had never believed them. They stood around her bed and watched her breathing slow, and they felt the moment when it stopped, and they sat with her for a long time afterward, not speaking, not moving, just being present with the absence she had left behind. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small cemetery on the ridge behind the Thorvald farm. 14 families attended, more people than had ever gathered for a burial in the settlement's history. They stood in the January cold and listened to Reverend Nygaard talk about heaven and redemption and the mysterious ways of a God that Sigrid had stopped believing in long ago. And when the service was over, when the grave had been filled and the prayers had been said, Bjorn Thorvald stood at the edge of the cemetery and made a promise to himself. He would find Sigrid's son. He would tell him what his mother had built, what she had taught, what she had meant to the people who had known her. He would make sure that the boy understood who Sigrid Kvalin was, even if he had to travel to Minnesota himself to deliver the message. It was the least he could do for the woman who had saved his life. The letter reached Leif in March of 1891. It was written by Bjorn Thorvald in English because Bjorn did not know Norwegian and could not read the language well enough to attempt a translation. It was long and detailed, describing the chamber that Sigrid had built, the storms she had survived, the lives she had saved, the respect she had earned from a settlement that had once dismissed her as a crazy old woman. Leif read the letter in the parlor of his house in St. Paul while his wife Anna sat across from him watching his face. He had not seen his mother in 8 years. He had not written to her in more than 2. He had received her letters, dozens of them, and he had read each one and then placed it in a drawer and tried not to think about what they meant. Now she was dead, and all those letters were waiting for him in a tin box under her bed, and the man who had written to him was asking if he would come to Dakota to settle her affairs. Leif sat in silence for a long time after he finished reading. Then he looked at his wife and said, "I need to go." Anna nodded. She had heard stories about his mother over the years, fragments that Leif had shared in moments of unguarded honesty. She knew about the fever of 1883, about the decision to send him away, about the guilt and anger that had calcified into something that looked like indifference. "I'll come with you," she said. "No." Leif shook his head. "This is something I need to do alone." He left for Dakota 2 weeks later, traveling by train to Huron, and then by wagon to the settlement near the James River. The journey took 4 days, and during those 4 days he thought about his mother more than he had thought about her in years. He thought about the letters she had written, all those letters describing storms and harvests, and the strange project she was building under her woodshed. He thought about the way she had held him when he was small, for the fever came before everything changed. He thought about the morning she had put him on the wagon to Minnesota, her face expressionless, her voice steady, telling him that this was for the best, that she was doing this because she loved him, that he would understand someday. He had not understood, not then, not for years afterward. He had only known that his mother had sent him away, that she had chosen to be alone rather than to be with him, that her love for him was not strong enough to overcome her fear. But now, traveling across the prairie toward the farm where she had lived and died, he found himself wondering if he had been wrong, if there were things about his mother that he had never understood, if the silence he had imposed on their relationship had been a cruelty greater than any she had inflicted on him. The questions had no answers. The dead keep their secrets. All he could do was go and see what she had left behind. Leif arrived at the farm on a gray April morning with clouds low over the horizon and a cold wind blowing from the north. The house was smaller than he remembered. The barn needed repair. The woodshed, the one his mother had written about in letter after letter, stood 20 feet from the back door, weathered but solid, looking no different from any other woodshed in Dakota Territory. He stood in the yard for a long time looking at it. Then he walked to the shed and opened the door and looked down at the hatch in the floor. Bjorn Thorvald had described the chamber in his letter, but the description had not prepared Leif for what he found when he lifted the hatch and descended the ladder into the space below. The stone walls stacked dry, rising to the ceiling like the interior of a cathedral. The S-curve of the flue channel running along the floor like a frozen river. The tunnel in the southeast corner leading away into darkness toward the house where his mother had spent the last 7 years of her life alone. And the warmth. Even now, months after the last firing, the stones held a residual warmth that he could feel against his palm when he pressed his hand to the wall. He stood in the chamber for a long time, not moving, barely breathing. He thought about his mother down here in the dark, stacking these stones one by one, building something that no one believed in, preparing for a disaster that no one else could see coming. He thought about the 9 people who had sheltered in her house during the school children's blizzard. He thought about the 5 families who had built chambers of their own because she had taught them how. He thought about the lives she had saved quietly without recognition, without reward. And he thought about the letters she had written. All those letters arriving every 2 weeks for 5 years, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply reaching out across the distance that he had put between them. He had never answered. He had been too angry, too hurt, too convinced that she had abandoned him when he needed her most. He had built a wall between himself and his mother, and he had maintained that wall for years, refusing to let it crumble, even when her letters came begging for a crack. Now she was dead, and the wall was meaningless, and all he had left were the stones she had stacked in the darkness beneath her woodshed. He found the tin box under her bed that afternoon. Inside were the letters, all of them. Every letter he had ever sent her, from the first one he wrote at age 7, his handwriting shaky and childish, to the last one he wrote at 19, 3 sentences that said nothing and meant everything. I am well. I have work. Please do not write so often. She had kept them all. She had kept them in a box under her bed where she could reach them in the night when sleep wouldn't come, where she could read them and remember the son she had sent away and wonder if she would ever see him again. And beneath the letters at the very bottom of the box was an envelope with his name on it. For Leif. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 3 pages written in Norwegian in his mother's careful handwriting. He read them slowly, struggling with the language he had not used in years, translating each word in his head before moving on to the next. The document described the chamber, the dimensions, the materials, the techniques, but it also described the principles behind the construction, the reasons why each element was necessary, the logic that connected the firebox to the flue channel, to the tunnel, to the warm floor of the house above. And it described his mother. Not much. Just enough to explain who she was and why she had built what she had built and what she hoped it would mean to whoever read these words after she was gone. The cold is not the enemy, she had written. Ignorance of the cold is the enemy. My father taught me that when I was 11 years old. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. Leif read those words and felt something crack inside his chest. He had been ignorant. He had been ignorant of his mother's love, of her sacrifice, of the reason she had sent him away. He had been ignorant of the life she had built in Dakota alone, without recognition, without the son she had given everything to protect. And now she was dead, and he would never be able to tell her that he understood. He turned to the last page of the document. There at the very bottom was a single sentence that his mother had labored over for 3 days, writing and rewriting, until every word felt exactly right. Stone does not forget warmth as easily as people forget what they owe to each other. Leif sat on the floor of his mother's bedroom, holding the pages in his hands, and wept. He stayed in Dakota for 2 months. He hired men to repair the barn and mend the fences and clear the debris that had accumulated over the years of his mother's declining health. He met with Bjorn Thorvald and heard the stories of the storms, the sheltering, the lives that had been saved. He walked through the settlement and saw the chambers that his mother had taught others to build, small monuments to her knowledge scattered across 20 square miles of prairie. And he made a decision. He would not sell the farm. He would not let the chamber fall into disrepair. He would find a family who needed a home and let them live on the land rent-free in exchange for maintaining what his mother had built. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. Before he left, he took the document to Huron and found a school teacher who could translate Norwegian into English. He paid her $5 to produce a clean copy, and he kept both versions, the original and the translation, for the rest of his life. When he died in 1948, the documents passed to his daughter, who donated them to a historical society in the 1960s. They sit there still in an archive that is rarely visited, waiting for someone who cares enough to find them. The woodshed is gone now. The house is gone. The barn is gone. But if you walk that piece of ground today near the James River in the part of South Dakota that was once Dakota territory, and you knew what to look for, you would find a slight depression in the soil behind where the woodshed once stood. A rectangle 12 feet by 8, slightly sunken at the center, where the roof boards finally rotted through sometime in the early 20th century, and the weight of the earth above pressed down into the empty space below. The granite is still there, 4,200 pounds of flat-faced riverstone patient and dark and cold, now holding nothing but the memory of warmth, holding it the way a stone always does, slowly, quietly, and for much longer than anyone thought possible. What Sigrid Kavalin built was not remarkable by the standards of the engineers who came after her. It required no expertise that could not be acquired by any person willing to study and to dig. The principles were ancient, dating back 2,000 years to the bathhouses of Rome. The materials were available anywhere that rivers ran and granite could be found. What made it remarkable was the willingness, the particular stubbornness of a woman who had lost almost everything and still chose to spend her energy not on survival alone, but on building something that would outlast the worst the world could send. She did not build the chamber for recognition. She built it because her father had shown her that the cold was not the enemy. Ignorance of the cold was the enemy. She built it because she had been cold before, and she understood at a cellular level that no amount of mockery could reach that understanding that a problem is not the same as being defeated by it. She built it under a woodshed where nobody would look in a space everybody ignored, with methods nobody wanted to hear about. And when the winter came, as the winter always comes, the small space under the woodshed said everything that Sigrid Kvalin had never been able to say out loud. It said, I was here. It said I knew something that mattered. It said I gave what I had to give, even when no one was asking, even when no one was listening, even when the only person who might have cared had stopped writing years ago. And it said in the language of stone and heat and patient endurance, I loved you, even when you couldn't feel it, even when you didn't believe it, even when the distance between us grew so great that I couldn't see across it anymore. I loved you, and I built this for you.